An example of where the left totally missed the point with language. Racism isn't exclusive to white people, and yes, non-whites can be racist. July 13th, 2025. Written by William James Delta, narrated by an automated voice. There's a deep frustration I've carried for some time, and it finally solidified during the rhetorical mess of the past few years. The activist left has completely missed the point with how it talks about racism. What began as a well-intentioned effort to highlight structural inequality turned into a rigid redefinition of the term itself. Racism is prejudice plus power, they insisted. This wasn't just an academic footnote. It became a moral litmus test, a gatekeeping mechanism for who could be labeled racist and who couldn't. Under this framework, only white people could be racist. Everyone else could be prejudiced, maybe, but never racist. The problem is, this idea doesn't hold up to reality. And worse, it damaged the very movement it was meant to advance. The first issue is with the word power. It's a loaded term, and the activist definition pretends it's clean and obvious. But power is not monolithic or evenly distributed. It exists on multiple axes: class, geography, age, culture, gender, education. Not all white people are powerful. Not all non-white people are powerless. Yet the activist framing flattens those distinctions into a binary: oppressor or oppressed. It assigns collective guilt and collective innocence based on racial identity alone. That's not justice. It's just a new kind of moral shorthand, and a dishonest one at that. And in today's world, the problem is even deeper. Power dynamics don't just shift from group to group or scenario to scenario. They shift from person to person. In many cases, it's not a question of which group has power in the abstract, but who holds influence, status, or authority in a given moment. What I believe, and what many people instinctively feel but are afraid to say, is that racism is not defined by who has power, but by whether the bias or act taps into a broader cultural sentiment. It's not just personal prejudice, and it's not just institutional oppression. It's a kind of prejudice with cultural resonance. Something becomes racist not only because of who says it, but because of what it echoes and reinforces within the society where it happens. Sometimes it's obvious, like a white person using a racial slur in a country with a long history of white supremacy. But sometimes it's more complicated. Take, for example, the wave of anti-Asian violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. In many of the most shocking cases, elderly Asian people being shoved to the ground, beaten, or worse, the perpetrators were black men. That's not comfortable to say, and it shouldn't be used to make blanket claims about black communities. But here's what was maddening. When people tried to point out the racial nature of these attacks, activists jumped in to say, that's not racism, that's just prejudice. Black people can't be racist. This is where the whole framework collapses. You have someone violently assaulting an Asian woman for no reason other than her race, and we're told it's not racist? That's absurd. This kind of rhetorical correction isn't harmless. It sends a message, whether intended or not. This isn't something we need to reckon with. It says, because this came from an oppressed person, it doesn't reflect anything deeper or worth examining. But we know that's not true. We know that if those attackers had been white, the headlines would have been about white racism, white hate, white supremacy, and honestly, that conversation would have been justified. But to then turn around and pretend these other attacks were isolated acts of mental illness or poverty, divorced from any cultural bias, just doesn't hold up. I'm not saying most black people harbor anti-Asian animus, just like I don't believe most white people walk around plotting to uphold white supremacy. But if we agree that racial bias can exist in a community without being universal, then we have to apply that standard across the board. If a white person acting on unconscious bias is participating in a system of racism, then a non-white person doing the same, when it echoes real, existing stereotypes or resentments, is also participating in racism. The scale and impact may differ, but the label fits. This is where the activist left has failed, not just semantically, but strategically. By refusing to call out racism wherever it occurs, they've created a moral loophole for anyone who doesn't check the oppressor box. And in doing so, they've alienated a huge swath of people, white and non-white, who might otherwise be sympathetic to their goals. Many white and non-white individuals felt just as gaslit by the activist redefinition of racism, because it didn't match what they'd experienced or witnessed in their own lives. They knew, often firsthand, that racism doesn't belong exclusively to white people. They saw the definition as not just morally wrong, but as a fundamentally flawed way to approach societal problems. And when they voiced that discomfort, they were often dismissed or accused of internalizing oppression. That kind of rhetorical policing doesn't inspire solidarity. It creates quiet resentment, even among the very communities the movement claims to fight for. And I believe that's part of what happened in 2024. We didn't just lose an election, we lost trust. A lot of the same voters who helped elect Joe Biden in 2020 either stayed home or switched sides, not because they became MAGA loyalists overnight, but because they felt like they weren't being spoken to anymore. They saw a movement more focused on language policing and social media performance than on making their lives better. They saw a movement that talked a lot about justice, but seemed incapable of honest self-reflection. Now we're in a nightmare scenario. Donald Trump is back, already unraveling norms and institutions. And while many swing voters are rapidly realizing the scale of that mistake, they still don't trust the Democrats. That's a damning place to be. And we're not going to claw our way back with more purity tests, more lectures, or more linguistic gymnastics. We need to get real about language. We need to stop treating definitions like political shields. And we need to be brave enough to say, yes, racism can come from anyone. Not because all racism is equal, not because all groups hold the same institutional weight, but because the health of a society depends on its ability to look honestly at itself, even when the truth is inconvenient. One of the best ways to honor the kernel of truth in the activist framing of racism, the insight that not all racism is the same, is to use more additive, descriptive language when appropriate. We can acknowledge that white racism carries a particular weight in American history without insisting that it's the only kind that exists. We can talk about Southern redneck racism, old Asian grandma racism, or wealthy liberal racism when context calls for it. These terms aren't about assigning collective guilt. They're about adding specificity and cultural texture. I don't think it's always necessary to add modifiers, but sometimes it helps clarify both the source and the social environment that shapes a certain expression of racial bias. That kind of linguistic honesty can foster deeper understanding, not division. If we want to rebuild a progressive movement that actually wins, we have to start by telling the truth. This isn't betrayal. This is cleanup. This is care. This is the beginning of something better.